But he ended his interview, and this is what really disappointed me. He said, I'll have lots of time to come back on Metro Morning because I've pretty much nothing much to do it now.
Oh.
And I'll have lots of free time. I'm going to do my podcast. And it's like the role of an MP, he diminished completely.
Look at that. Here we are halfway through the month of May already. It's the 14th day of May. We're heading into a long holiday weekend in this part of the world, which also means that people are just grinding it out to make sure that they can get away early on Friday, and then they got to make up for the day off on Monday. So I know you're all working really hard, but so I might suggest this piece of Now and Next is probably something that you might want to set aside just so you got time, you know, when you're doing the road trip to the cottage this weekend or whatever it happens to be doing on the holiday weekend. We'll be happy to be involved in your weekend routine. Dave Trafford here, and it is time for our comms and strategy team around the table. We're joined this week by Emery Aikens from AMA Communications, and Bob Reid is here from Broadway Strategy, and our friend Lindsay Broadhead is doing some professional development this week, unable to join us. So, but we will miss her, and I don't know if we should be offended that she's decided to do a professional development webinar rather than sit in with us, Bob. I don't know, but we'll take it. We'll take it as we get it. I think you're muted.
She's improving herself.
Yeah,
which will be for our benefit in the long run, anyways.
Lindsay has the ability to make people around her better, so we can all benefit from it. You're right.
There we go.
Absolutely. So lots to talk about this week, and in no sort of real order, but I think the one thing that struck me this morning and it kind of hit me and was this story out of Major League Baseball, and you don't have to be a Major League Baseball fan to know about to some degree about the Black Sox scandal of the last century, and when the fix was in on the World Series. And it's funny, I'm rewatching the Boardwalk Empire, and Arnold Rothstein plays a prominent role in that show. He was the guy behind cooking the books and rigging the 1919 World Series. And the White Sox were in there. The Shoeless Joe Jackson was the guy who was at the front of that, and it's become this epic sort of mythical story. Bob, what was the movie? Build It and They Will Come.
Field of Dreams.
Field of Dreams,
oh,
right? And he's one of the guys that wanders out of the cornfield playing in the ball game, and this whole idea that because he was involved in gambling in the game, he was banned for life from ever being involved in the game again, certainly wasn't eligible to be in the Hall of Fame. On that list as well, Pete Rose, the all-star from the Cincinnati Reds days. He was the manager there, accused of gambling when he was gambling on baseball when he was managing the Reds, and probably should have long ago otherwise have been in the Hall of Fame. Well, now the commissioner has lifted the ban, saying now that they're dead, the ban is no longer in effect. So it's kind of turned things upside down. On the one hand, Rose and Jackson probably, based on their work on the field, should be in the Hall of Fame. You're still going to get people who are going to nod and shake their head and tisk and say they broke the rules. There's not a chance that they should be there posthumously or not.
It's a tough debate, and I find myself kind of on the fence on it. And usually I'm not that guy, but the rationale being the commissioner said in our view, it doesn't make sense to continue a ban posthumously. It's in effect for life, so they're ineligible from receiving those honors while they're alive. But it doesn't make sense for that to carry on in perpetuity. And the Hall of Fame does go back to the classic era, the early days of baseball, and inducts people from way back when these days. So now the door is open for that. The previous commissioner, Giamatti, who imposed the lifetime ban on Pete Rose specifically, he's passed on now, but his son is very vocally upset about this change. And he said, my father brought that in to preserve the integrity of baseball, the integrity of the game. And this move undermines that because now characters like Pete Rose are eligible, despite the fact that, and there's a very strong piece in the Toronto Star today by their lead baseball writer. These guys knew what they were doing at the time. They deliberately broke the rules. They deliberately did unethical things, which tarnished the sport, broadly speaking, its professional reputation. And so there needs to be a consequence for that, and it needs to be a very clear consequence to prevent anybody in the future from saying, well, it's not such a big deal, even if we do get caught. And at the end of it, I think I come down on that side of the line. I think if you've got an organization that is as big, as influential, as important as a major sports league like that, there needs to be integrity around the game, and there needs to be a code of conduct and an ethical standard that anybody who's involved with it needs to meet and adhere to. And if they don't, there needs to be consequences. Otherwise, I think it does undermine the integrity of the game at the end of all of that. Pete Rose's stats speak for themselves, and they always will. They always have, despite the clouds over his head, not only for gambling, but also he was accused of statutory rape when he was in his 30s. So this is an unsavory character, but his stats are undeniable. And so he's always going to have that asterisk anyway. So I say, let the stats speak for themselves, but keep them out of the hall.
Yeah, Emery, it would be like, if you flipped the coin and said, based on that thinking from the baseball commissioner, well, now that he's dead, it doesn't really matter. It means that we would reinstate Lance Armstrong's Tour de France championships after he dies. I mean, he would be back in the Hall of Fame for cycling. Yeah. Nobody would put up with that at all. Like Bob says, they knew they were cheating.
Yeah, I wasn't on the fence on it at all. And maybe it's like the being raised Catholic, but your sins aren't forgiven when you die. Excuse me, sorry.
Pete Rose needs to spend some time in purgatory.
So, sorry, you're gonna have to skip me.
Well, you know what? But might come down to a dispensation from Pope Leo at this point. You want reform in the church, and away we go.
He could come into play there. Yeah,
exactly.
But you're right, Dave. It's a bigger argument than that. Lance Armstrong is a good example. Any organization, as I said, of that stature, if you're willing to tolerate even to that degree unethical behavior, what does that say about the values and the principles of your organization? And I think that's the fundamental underpinning on this.
Yeah,
that's what I was going to say.
Well, but I mean, there needs to be guardrails, right, Anne-Marie? And if they're well established, this isn't something that just happened yesterday and we decided we're going to have the debate and they've overturned it. But once you go down that rabbit hole, that's a challenge for the sport. But I would suggest to you that when they had the home run slugging fest in the 90s and they knew all these guys were jacked up on drugs, they still hold those records. I mean, you can see where baseball, sport in general, has those challenges. Ben Johnson, I mean, the same kind of thing, right? Where we had this national torture, self-inflicted torture when Johnson won the gold medal in Korea and came back, and we realized that he was a drug using cheater.
Yeah, it sets a precedent, and it's an unsavory one, and I don't think we should accept it. That it seems to undermine actually what he did by saying rules were broken. Yes, rules were broken, but he committed actually crimes. Was he not? Was he not convicted of crimes? So it was illegal what he did, and he does set a precedent for future that it doesn't really matter. You can break these rules and commit these crimes, and it doesn't really matter. You'll still have your whatever they do for. I'm not a sports person, but I think they raise your picture or your number or something. And yeah, we shouldn't be doing that.
Well, and again, you go back to Bob, the idea that, if the Cincinnati Reds want to acknowledge his accomplishments on the field and raise his sweater number to the banner, to the rafters or whatever, fine, go crazy.
Yeah.
But there's a distinction between those two things. Still with the sports thing, and I will say this as we record this, is May the 14th. It's a Wednesday. The Leafs playing Game 5 against the Panthers tonight. I looked it up. The Game 5 winner in a 7-game series is almost 80% likely to win the series. So tonight matters, right? Yeah. And away we go. But I thought it was interesting to see after one of the games this week, one of the vice chairman of the Panthers got into a Twitter fight with a Leaf fan, and that's bad enough, Anne-Marie, that the executive of the professional team would take on some troll who is a Leaf fan here, but that he engaged a fan who equated a bad hit, to the Palestinian situation in the Middle East. Sweet, merciful baby Jesus. I mean, what is he thinking?
Yeah.
Oh, he wasn't thinking. It was. I remember thinking, this is so 2023. Have we not learned all those lessons about, especially in the Twitter X sphere? It's just ripe with that kind of crap. Like, get the hell off of it. And if you're going to be on it when you're feeling feisty, or let's say drunk, or whatever, that's the worst place to be, and it gets people in trouble. And I really thought we'd learned our lesson about that, but apparently he didn't. And I have a feeling he'll be forgiven down the road. But I just remarked that people really don't know how to protect their own reputations at all. And one of the ways to do that is just to get off of that social media that way. It's just, especially if you can be, poked at, which obviously it can be.
Well, and the good news is here, Bob, that the NHL acted pretty quickly. And the response back was something about responding to the guy as a 51st state anti-Semite loser. Okay, there's no gray in that.
No. None whatsoever. And the exec who posted it, he's not some schlub. He's got status with the governors of the NHL. He's high brass with the Florida Panthers, because he's the CEO of a highly successful business. I think he's in insurance or financial services of some kind. So, this is a guy with a high corporate position who should have known better than to get into the muck with a pissed off hockey fan. And to his credit, he has responded quickly as well. He made clear in a response statement that his conduct and his language used in that exchange does not reflect on the Florida Panthers organization. He's very sorry for it, and he's going to work with them to try and make good on this. So, good for him. It'll be short lived, but it's a classic one, as you say, Dave, of how the hell did you not know better going in?
Well, the other part of this is, in the irony, maybe the financial company is called Virtue.
There we go.
Right. And he didn't distance his tweet from Virtue, but he did distance the tweet from the Panthers. But even at that, I begin to wonder, for the most part, we all know that, generally speaking, that level of executive rarely touches the social media account, Anne-Marie. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, this is probably the rare moment when he actually logged into his own X account and fired off a flaming arrow.
Yes, something was happening in his life in that moment that he fell vulnerable to that. And as Bob said, he did. His communication people slapped him quickly enough to say, "What the hell are you doing? Delete that tweet, and now you're going to have to apologize if anyone notices it," which of course they did.
But at a time when the president of the United States does exactly this kind of thing routinely, that does send a signal I think this is a related symptom of that. When we're constantly seeing outbursts like that at that level, then that's going to spread.
Well, and this has become part of the news cycle too, in terms of coverage, Bob. I mean, you know, the way that the media generally, not just in the United States, certainly here in Canada, we glom onto every social media post from fill in the blank, whether it's, you know, Donald Trump or hockey executives or anybody else in that sphere. Mm-hmm. And it's almost as if you've got a social media bureau chief now that is going out there looking for this stuff. It's low-hanging fruit. It turns into clickbait for sure. Yeah. But you would think, even in that media environment, it's even more of a problem for a guy like this to be engaged in you know, what he's taken on the trolls on social media.
But when it's an official account of someone of stature, of note, it's an instant press release.
Exactly.
Earlier in my career, you know, working for the Premier of Ontario, if we had a message that we needed to get out, if we had a statement that we needed to make sure got seen, we had to go to Canada Newswire and have them distribute it to media newsrooms so that it would be sure to be seen and reported upon. Well, now you can do it on Twitter. Mm-hmm. There it is.
When I was a Metrolink spokesperson for all those years, I had a large following, but the media were primarily who I was speaking to often, and that in customers. And honest to God, every word I said, they would turn. Sometimes I would say, no, that's not a news story. But I'm glad you saw my tweet, but instantly. Yeah. I mean, it was incredible how fast it was. That was when Twitter was more of a normal space to be in. Yeah. But it was the way to get out news. And it was one of the ways that I got out actually good news too.
Right.
But it's out the bad news too.
And you must have been always conscious that anything you posted is fair game to be quoted, reported upon, and probably would be.
Yeah, I stepped in it a couple of times just because it was an atmosphere where you kind of said everything. And I remember when Indigo got into selling personal devices, the personal pleasure devices. And I thought, oh, geez, we got a whole wall of personal in Indigo. And it was during the pandemic. And I just thought it was interesting. But apparently that was everybody thought it was funny, but I was asked to take it down.
It took me back to the old Consumers Distributing catalog, where there'd be a model using a device to massage her neck and her shoulders.
I think they're gone. I think Heather Reisman got rid of them when she awakened during the pandemic and saw the walls of personal devices. She went, not my bookstore, I think.
Yeah, well, there's a whole narrative there that we could. This is a series here in this subject. You know what occurs to me though, Bob? How different the world would have been. Like play the sliding door scenario. If there had been social media in the days of Mike Harris, because there was probably he was probably the most controversial political figure in the country in a long time. And if you had, can you imagine if, you had inserted social media into that conversation between the Premier and guys like John Clark and right. And the head of, the union, OPSU unions, that would have been something to think about. In some respects, that probably, would have actually taken the agenda right off the rails, because it would have been crazy.
No, but we would have taken it away from him. we wouldn't have let him near the keyboard.
How do you do this? How do you do that? A couple of the things, it occurs to me, we were talking about the, posthumously being forgiven. So, if that were the case in the United States, Bob, then, once Donald Trump goes to God or wherever he's going, he would no longer be a felon, by the way, if we played that rule. So, he might be welcoming this Pete Rose thing. What do you make of the whole Qatar deciding that they're going to give the president an airplane as a gift. I think it was the most bizarre. I thought it was a meme when I saw it pop up on a news feed.
Can you just imagine the president of the United States is going to fly around in a luxury plane all over? Like, it's just he continues to do things that would have felled so many other world leaders. It's for sure unethical. It's sure conflict of interest. It's probably completely illegal. It breaches the Constitution, and he's subject to bribes. Like, it's just a crazy thing. But his reaction is, "Why wouldn't I?
It'd be stupid if we didn't do it.
It'd be stupid.
I didn't do it." So he's going to fly around in this gross plane. But I also wonder, he already ordered Air Force One planes, and he's annoyed because they're late. Yeah. But so does that mean, are they still coming? Like, or I don't know what he didn't really say what's going to happen with them.
I believe Boeing has said they're actually now they're going to find a way to accelerate the delivery of those, and so they can probably get them in fairly short order, or at least before this term is up. So there's no need for the Qatari aircraft. I'd love to be a fly on the wall in the Secret Service office when that story broke, and they're like, "He's gonna what?
Yeah.
How are we gonna sweep that thing?"
Yeah. You'd almost have to take the whole thing apart and then put it back together, because you never know what's
Nut
in
by
that
bolt,
aircraft,
yeah.
right?
Yeah, that's right.
But just to Anne-Marie's point, Bob, the whole idea that he would take this as a gift from the royal family of the Qatari government, I'm thinking, you will know this, just generally speaking, it's frowned upon when political leaders take gifts from other governments, or anybody else for that matter, in terms of conflict. This is a matter for Congress to actually approve, and he's just bowling ahead like they don't exist.
Well, and that's the thing, right? We're not dealing with a normal president here. We're dealing with somebody who sees himself on a completely different level. As he said when he got in trouble in the first term, well, if the president does it, then it's okay, because the president is this high, mighty, exalted, in his view, otherworldly figure that the rules don't apply to, and that he doesn't have to give a shit about the rules, because he makes the rules. He decides what rule is okay and what one isn't. And it would be stupid not to take the 747. Like,
I had to turn away a fruit basket, for fuck's sakes. When I was a public servant, you're not allowed to take any gifts whatsoever. And I had to tell the delivery man, "I'm sorry, I can't accept the fruit basket."
Well, there was a day, not that long ago, maybe 25 years ago, where if somebody from a law firm or whatever, they were taking somebody to a Leaf game, or that kind of thing, that would happen. That's way back in the rear view mirror. So the fruit basket is not being facetious. Those are the rules, and this is just so blatant.
It's written in law about not taking gifts. If it's worth under $20, I think is the rule. You have to go to the CEO of the organization that you work for. If you're this is for public servants, and give a rationale why that would be okay to take. It was the stupidest conversations about silly gifts like that. You couldn't have a lunch. It's written in law. So I really adhered to it. It's like, I never put my feet on the seat on transit either, because somebody take your picture. But it was, you had to be very, very careful if you're in any way high profile. And I'm just this little person in the dot of this universe, but this is the leader of the largest country in the world, and he's accepting gifts like that. It's just crazy. Talk about setting precedents.
Well, if the Prime Minister Carney were to take a gift from an international leader, he can do that, Bob, but they have to be set aside and registered. And it's one of those things that, it almost is a museum piece to that extent,
Yeah.
And that's how it would be viewed. The indifference in this is nauseating. in terms of the American public. It just, I don't know how you say, well, what could else happen? Because there will always be something else.
Yeah, there will be.
Speaking of what else will happen, how long is the Dundas debate going to go on? Good God.
Here we go again.
Right?
Well, it was the report itself, because it's all about the Dundas name is what people are talking about. But the report itself was actually about having a partnership with TMU. And that was about building a transit innovation center that they would actually, it would be part of their strategy to build new innovative things that would help make transit work better. Like, who wouldn't want that? That's really good. But couched in that partnership was about the name change. You know, they could change
for the subway station. Yeah, from Dundas to TMU.
Because the timing would work with Finch, and because whatever the rationale for is. They had to have known, though, that would be the focus, as opposed to this other really good thing. And they should not have included it. That was a mistake, because that's all that was focused on and is being focused on. That's what the news stories are focused on, is the name change.
Okay, but we just finished talking about the stupidity on social media. What we're focusing on here generally is stupidity, Bob.
Yeah, but I'm going to push back on this one, Emery, because if you take that dimension out of it, the partnership, the innovation lab, whatever the heck that dimension is going to be, if you take that out of it, then it's just solely about the name change. And isn't that a stupid idea? And that's going to cost money, which Ryerson will pay for. I think that's the only other saving grace in this, that if they're determined to go ahead and erase the Dundas name and take it out of, rename the subway station, if somebody else is going to pay for that, not the TTC and by extension Toronto taxpayers, then so be it. That I think that would be stupid not to take the free money being offered by Ryerson to do this. So it's kind of an elegant solution. Fundamentally, it pisses me off about name changing, because I went to TMU when it was under its old name. That's what my degree has on it. Toronto District School Board is changing the name of my high school because it was Sir John A. Macdonald, and that's got to go, because we're erasing all of these characters from history. And as I've said many times when this comes up, if you just do that, if you just cancel them and wipe them out, you lose the opportunity to talk about what they actually did that had people upset, and why that is something that needs to be noted and recognized and understood and reconciled, rather than just, we're going to put that under the rug. Forget he ever existed. So
it's not gotten that much attention, but Ford government has one of their strategies to raise money for transit was to sell naming rights to centers. Like Brampton did it, and this GO station is actually called, instead of just Brampton GO, it's called Brampton Innovation District GO. Guess what people call it?
Brampton GO.
Brampton GO. And Oshawa did it.
Oshawa.
Oshawa GO, Oshawa Durham College GO. And it's actually not the station closest to Durham College, because there's another station closer to it, but whatever, put that aside. Nobody calls it that. They still call it by the name, but that wasn't after a person, at least. And the risks that come with naming it after a person. History is not kind often, but I think this one is just so wrapped in controversy. I just would have announced the Innovation Center, the partnership first, and then down the road talked about the name.
P.S. We're renaming the subway station.
Well, but here's the sponsorship thing aside, and I don't know, if that's going to matter much at all, because it used to be the Air Canada Center. Now it's not. So that can kind of come and go every 5 years when the contract's up, which to me is a stupid thing, because I want to know where I'm going. I want to know that I'm going to Yonge and Dundas. But that's one part of it. But to your point, Bob, around Dundas and Ryerson and John A., we're in this era where we want to have a serious conversation in this country, and a mature conversation about reconciliation, about truth and reconciliation. It's at the heart of all of this. And if we can't talk about who John A. was and what he did, what Dundas did and who he was, what Ryerson did and who he was, then we can't really have a truth and reconciliation conversation, can we?
No, not in the least, because we're just not going there. We're taking the easy way out, which is to erase and rename and replace and cancel and close the door on the history, rather than taking an adult look at it and talking about those very important things, so that the next generation of kids, I mean, when I went to Sir John A. Macdonald Collegiate, when I went to Ryerson, we didn't really talk much about who those figureheads were. And, we learned about their history, and obviously we learned about our first prime minister, but the points at issue now were not anything that was talked about, and they should have been, and they should be going forward for the next generations of students in those institutions. But instead, they're going to have different names, and that won't be discussed at all, and that's wrong.
Entirely. And we can't really have this cause and effect conversation about whether it's, racial communities or indigenous communities or First Nations communities, Anne-Marie, and how they were mistreated historically. If we don't have that conversation, as raw and as rough as it might be, taking us out of our comfort zone around what it was like when Henry Dundas was, a politician in Scotland, or when John A. was the Prime Minister of Canada. We have to have that part of the conversation. And it's not to be, saving anybody. That's not, I've been working on this project with in the Arctic. And one of the questions that we've asked a lot of the folks from Nunavut, for example, is what is the one thing that is misunderstood about the North in the rest of Canada? And 2 or 3 of the people we talked to almost immediately, reflexively said, we don't need to be saved, right? We want to be part of the conversation. And this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to save people from Canada's history.
Yeah, I think it's a really, really tough conversation, because I think what happens is it's the celebration. So when something is named after a person, we're celebrating who they were, the good part of who they were. So how do you talk about the things perhaps that weren't as great about that person, and still celebrate them? And that's where the challenge often comes. But I think the conversation is often led. These kinds of conversation are often led by people that weren't impacted by it. So it's do you know what I mean? So when truth and reconciliation, when those talks are led by white people and settlers, as they're called, I think it loses its meaning, and that's where outrage can often come. So they're really tough conversations. There aren't easy answers to it, but the renaming doesn't fix anything by any means, but it's a really tough one. And there's different, if you listen to especially Dundas's ancestors talk about his past is a more complicated, it's a more nuanced conversation than is often just said. He supported slaves. That's the way it's said, and that's like, you have to change everything. It's a much more nuanced and more challenging conversation about what he was all about. So it's a really tough.
That's another aspect to this is there are degrees of this kind of thing. Like, nobody argues about Stalingrad being renamed after the war, right? That was pretty much no argument with that one. And statues of other dictators that were forced upon their people being torn down after they've been put out of our collective misery. Those are the right kinds of things. And to your point, Anne-Marie, they're driven by the people who are directly affected and directly harmed, and saying, no, we're not going to continue to honor that name by having it on one of our major cities. That I get. But when we get into these more, as you said, nuanced situations, then I think we lose the thread and we lose the opportunity that those discussions have for education, for enlightenment, and for reconciliation.
So let me suggest just for a second here, this strictly by coincidence, but John A.'s birthday is said to be January the 11th.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and a guy who shares that birthday is another prime minister, Jean Chrétien. Both of them, January 11th. Now, if we're going to cancel John A. because of his historic reputation, Jean Chrétien was the Minister of Indian Affairs at the time when we still had residential schools in this country.
Mm-hmm.
So when do we name the Jean Chrétien Library, Anne-Marie? When do we do that? When do we have something of note named after Jean Chrétien?
There's probably things named after him already, but
well, to my point, already we know his history, and we have gone ahead and done that.
Mm-hmm. No, I know. We have a habit of doing that and celebrating, especially politicians. We celebrate them long after the fact or soon after the fact. And to Bob's point, when we recognized after the war, it was very close. Like the actions were taken pretty quickly, where these ones are often very historical, not perhaps the Jean Chrétien, we still have him with us, but like the Dundas one is very long in history. Why it suddenly is triggered is hard to know, but what triggers it. But there is always that risk with naming things after people that, 50 years from now, people are going to disagree with it. And Chrétien you always have feelings about Chrétien. He's one of those people and those politicians, and it's very hard to say. There's always a risk with it. So not a fan of naming things after people.
Yeah, okay, and I agree with that just generally, but if we're looking at the Ryerson example specifically, Bob, I mean, that thread pulls right through until the governments of the 90s, when we still had residential schools and we still had, I come back to, does that diminish Jean Chrétien's accomplishments as the prime minister of this country, and anything else that we may attach to it?
I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, right.
Right. And I'm sure if you asked Quebecers, who were not thrilled that he was the justice minister who patriated the Canadian Constitution over Quebec's objections, and they still haven't signed it to this day, you'd get some pushback there too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and now I'm not suggesting for a second that it makes sense one way or the other. I'm only saying that in the moment, right now, historically, we all know a character who has been involved in the very same kind of circumstance that Dundas and Ryerson and John A. have been involved in. We apply that historically a century, ago lens or so, but this is happening still right now, and we do not want to recognize it in the moment.
It often happens with religious leaders, priests, for example. There are so many churches and community centers and so forth named after despicable human beings. But there isn't a lot of pushback to that. It's weird.
Don't get me started. But
the J. Edgar Hoover building.
Exactly.
The FBI headquarters in Washington, which is not far from Dulles International Airport, named after Allen Dulles, who was the head of the CIA, who personally presided over the executions of foreign leaders that the U.S. wasn't crazy about in those days. So, there's a lot.
Yeah. So there is always something in the name, I suppose. Any surprise to you? I we always talk about the studies that you can do the survey on the surveys that we understand don't need to be done, and this might be one of them from StatsCan, noting that fewer Canadians are traveling to the United States. Anecdotally, we've all experienced that. I don't know about you guys if you've made any kind of personal commitments to or not to travel to the U.S. I know we're not going, and I know friends in my circle have expressly said they're not going. I have friends who have family in the United States and are really challenged by wanting to go. And I get the argument, well, you can't blame all the Americans. They don't necessarily all hate us. More than half of them voted for Donald Trump. So that's where this kind of conversation starts. That's having a huge hit on their economy, Bob. We're not going down south for, breaks to Florida or wherever,
Yeah.
Myrtle Beach.
Yeah, I applaud it. I actually made a trip to the U.S. to Nashville just over a month ago because it was booked and paid for and actually
Right.
coordinated between my wife and some American friends who were coming. We were all meeting in that city and spending the weekend. And so I could have canceled it on principle and eaten the cost of the flights and everything else. I didn't. We went. But I was not wearing anything with a maple leaf on it, as I often tend to do. And anytime it did come up, if, people would ask, so where are you folks visiting from? As soon as they heard Canada, the reaction was actually very positive. Like nobody was negative. Nobody was aggressive. One Uber driver said, well, our president sure isn't being real nice to you folks about now, is he? We're sorry about that. We're glad you're here. We're glad you came to visit. So the patriotic Canadian in me thinks it's wonderful that people are changing their plans. We were actually going to do a baseball and Motown weekend in Detroit this summer, and I put the kibosh on that. I don't want to go there. I don't want to give any more of my money. But here's the flip side of it. My wife's American.
Yeah.
And her family, except for her sister, who's in Nova Scotia, all of the rest of her family, so her late brother's kids, they're all in the U.S. And they want to have a family gathering in the run-up to Christmas this year. And that's a hard one for me because I don't want to be the Scrooge who says, no, we're not going because I'm mad at Donald Trump and, he's been shitty to Canada. You got to draw that line. So I also fully empathize with anybody in that position or those who say, look, I'm still going to go about my business. I'm still going to go to the places I want to go to and be with the people I want to be with, because even if I cancel all of that, it's not really going to make a difference. But these stats show it does if enough people do that. And the numbers, you can't argue with the numbers. It's been 4 consecutive months of significant year-over-year declines in trips to the U.S. from Canada.
Yeah, well, and I'm looking at the graph they've got on the CTV website, and the number of return trips to Canadian residents return into the United States. It's the lowest it's been since the pandemic. So that's saying something, and it's only May.
Yeah.
So it is making a difference. It will make a difference. But on the other side of that, though, there's 2 issues here, I think. One is affordability, and it's double pronged, I think. Anne-Marie, the idea is first the comparison of the dollar, our dollar to the U.S. dollar. That makes it a challenge on affordability. But if you happen to be an auto worker who's losing their job or is being laid off for an indeterminate amount of time, or anybody else who's been affected by the tariffs, affordability then becomes also a real issue. It's not that I may not want to go. I just can't afford to go. So, they're cooking the golden goose on both ends.
Yeah, it's very true. During Trump's first term, I made a decision not to travel to the States. And I have made a decision I won't travel to the States unless there's some reason I had to. I do have family as well in the U.S. that we keep in touch, but I'm generally not going to visit them. And what the trickle down effect of all of that is all the small businesses and the tourism, the tourist sites and the sports sites and all of those things, so the numbers show this, the graph shows these numbers have reduced traveling down, but who gets the impact are the small businesses. And that kind of bothers me, because when people say buy Canadian, I buy into that as well. But they'll say, well, I'm not going to this. I can't think of something else right now, but a Starbucks, because that's, not a Canadian company. But these are all stores. They're all people. They're all people that work in those. Those are all jobs, and Canadian jobs. So I'm torn by all of that, because you're not supporting that. Just not one of my sons is impacted because he's a wine distributor. Most of his wine comes from the U.S. and his company is pretty devastated right now. So that has an impact on Canadian jobs as well. So all of it is just a mess, and so I'm torn by it all. One story I want to tell you is a friend recently went to the Dominican. So she's in the Dominican. She doesn't think she has to worry about that, but almost every tourist there at the resort was American, and they all asked her where she's, because you do share that when you're talking over drinks at the bar, where you're from, and they made jokes about it. So she didn't get apologies; she got jokes. Oh, can't wait! Bet you can't wait to be our 51st state. They thought it was funny, and she was not thinking it was funny at all. And it bothered her. It's just like, I don't want to even have to talk to anybody, because I don't want the jokes either.
Well, it spoils the whole point of the vacation, right?
Exactly.
I mean, holy kid.
You don't have to think about that.
Well, the other side of it is, Bob, if nothing else, we've got Americans saying sorry almost as often as Canadians say sorry. But
well, they're feeling the pain. This is a self-imposed tariff, right?
Yeah, completely.
We've decided we're just not going, in addition to all the countervailing tariffs that Canada has put in. And whether it's because of tariff responses we've taken or just boycotts like this, they're feeling it. They are feeling it. There was one of the networks did a great report probably 2 months ago, like at the very beginning of the start of the travel season. And it was a couple of communities in Maine where so much of their annual, year after year, the one owner said, we have the same families who've been coming here for years from Canada. And every other day now the phone rings and it's one of them saying, because of all this, we're not coming this year. Yeah. And he said, and my business, he said, I don't know how I can replace that business. So on the micro level like that, and at the macro level, Kentucky bourbon exports, these are the things you got to do when you're in a battle. And they're not pleasant, they're not pretty, but they will get results. And I'm with you, Anne-Marie. I'm hopeful that the long and the short of this means together, all of these acts will put enough pressure on people to get their heads out of their asses and get this fixed.
Yeah.
Get us back to where we have been for so many years and decades, and back in true partnership again.
Well, in so many respects, we always talk high level about the relationship between Canada and the United States, and the economic and the trade and all of those sorts of things, the historic part of it. And we've heard the Prime Minister talk about a reset in terms of our relationship with Ottawa, Washington. And that might be faster or easier, Bob, to reset than this is. Because once you get out of the habit of taking your trip to Maine or wherever it is you're doing, I know a bunch of guys that do, minor league baseball tours in the States in the summer. Mm-hmm. They'll follow, go around. They're not going. Once you stop doing that, and that's not part of your cultural routine, it ain't coming back.
And especially if you replace it with an alternative where you go, boy, we never would have gone to Quebec, or we never would have gone to insert Canadian destination here, or a foreign but non-American destination. Once you get used to that, once you set those habits and it becomes your new place to go, those don't change easily. And it's very much at the individual, at the personal, habitual level, far more importantly than it is at that macro level. Dave, you're right.
Well, and you're seeing industry already responding to it, where Air Canada talked about it, increasing the number of flights to Latin America, and they're all the airlines in Canada cutting back on their trips into the States. So this is really, I think, going to be the canary in the mine for the long-term outcome of this relationship, Anne-Marie.
It will be, and I think the Americans are starting to feel it. I think Americans that voted for him, those that didn't vote for him, they're starting to feel it, and I think they're going to be more successful than our efforts will ever be, because if it's hitting their pocketbooks, they're losing their jobs, their businesses small businesses devastated. They'll have more of an influence, I think, than more so, because Trump has, I think, lost his mind, but they'll have more of an influence on all of the people in government that can make this change.
I got to give a real quick shout out to the Buffalo Bisons AAA baseball club. They're the junior Blue Jays just down the highway and over the border in Buffalo. They sent a beautiful message out to any Canadians who had previously bought tickets from them. It was very subtly stated, but it made the point. It said, we know things are a little different right now. We want everyone to come to the ballpark and to feel good about being here and to enjoy watching some great baseball. We really hope that you'll join us again soon. We want you here. We welcome you. And they had a 25% discount for Canadians buying tickets to reflective of the 25% tariff wall that was going up at that time. I thought it was beautifully done, and a first-class piece of really smart corporate communications.
The only thing that would have been better is if they would have taken Canadian dollars at par. That would have, right there you go. But no, you're right, and they're all in that bind, right? I mean, and that's an interesting Buffalo-Toronto connection is critical, and certainly in this part of the world. And we don't have time to get into it, but I'm going to refer you guys, if you read The Economist, there's a really interesting piece this week about the two economies in the United States, and there's a mega economy and there is a Democrat economy, shall we say. And the mega economy is doing surprisingly well. It really is. If you get a chance, check it out. It's on The Economist. And yes, it's worth the subscription fee. So just subscribe and get behind the paywall.
What is, I know we got to go, but what is the MAGA economy? How do they define that?
Well, they start to talk about, Bubba in the truck and the kind of coffee he drinks and the cultural experiences. We think that there's a divide politically in the United States. The Economist has defined a cultural divide that is turned into an economic divide, and there are two distinct economies in the United States. It's fascinating. So I would refer you to the piece. Otherwise, Bob, if you don't want to go behind the paywall, I'll send you a gift article. Just before we go, I'm going to talk about this with our On the Ledge team tomorrow. But knowing your background, your comms expertise, your insights here, Nate Erskine-Smith felt disrespected, Anne-Marie, by being left out of the Carney cabinet.
Ooh, that just the use of that word gave me the cringes, because it sounds very much sour grapes, and it just, I don't know, it just gave me I just didn't really kind of like it, but I didn't have strong feelings about it. Then I heard him on Metro Morning today, and he repeated all of the same things, tries to be nice on one hand, and then saying how disappointed that he thought he was making a huge difference on the housing file. And I'm like, okay, it was a very short period of time, but okay. And I understand that there was a lobby group really pushing, like a loosely formed lobby group of people pushing to keep him as housing minister. So I think he was thought that was going to be successful. And when he got the call from the prime minister, he was quite disappointed, and that's when he penned it. But he ended his interview, and this is what really disappointed me. He said, I'll have lots of time to come back on Metro Morning because I've pretty much nothing much to do it now.
Oh,
And I'll have lots of free time. I'm going to do my podcast. And it's like the role of an MP, he diminished completely to this part-time, take a couple of phone calls from constituents kind of job. It really diminished it. I was really quite taken aback by it.
So the folks in his beaches riding should be disrespected, Bob?
yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Holy cow.
Yeah. That's astonishing because I think Nate's really good. I've found him to be a very strong and effective communicator for his party and his government. So I'm surprised that he didn't realize how whiny and self-pitying this was going to sound. And one way to make sure you don't get promoted by the boss is to publicly crap on the boss for not giving you a post this time around. As an aside, very interesting, Queen's Park Observer says that it's hearing that there might have been some design behind this in keeping Nate Erskine-Smith out of a cabinet role so that this fall at the Ontario Liberal Leadership Review of Bonnie Crombie post the last election loss, should there be a movement to change leaders, Nate Erskine-Smith, who finished second to Bonnie Crombie last time around, would be freely positioned to then be able to take that on. I have no idea if there's any substance to any of that, but it's a juicy theory anyway.
Well, it's spin I actually heard during the Liberal leadership campaign here in Ontario, because it was the federal caucus that encouraged Nate Erskine-Smith to run for the leadership in Ontario, hoping he would win it because they didn't want him sitting in their room. So there's plenty of intrigue to go around. All right, that'll do it for us. It's now and next, our version of the cast here, the comms and strategy team. Thanks to Bob Reid and to Anne-Marie Aikens. And again, just a reminder, if you're watching this on YouTube, hit the subscribe button. You'll get this show and On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast. We'll be recording that with the crew tomorrow. That includes Kathleen Wynne, Tim Hudak, whom I'm told was among those pushing for Nate Erskine-Smith to be back in the housing portfolio, but we'll ask him when we get to that. John Wright will be here, as well as Keith Leslie. So everybody around the table for On the Ledge, and it all lands in this YouTube channel. So subscribe to the channel and make sure that you leave us a comment, etc. So it's good to see the comments popping up from time to time. And same here. If you've got something to say about now and next, be sure to leave us your comments. All right, that'll do it for me. Go Leafs. I'm not quite sure what kind of mood I'm going to be in tomorrow when we record On the Ledge, but yeah, it's very anxious. Very anxious. All right. I'm Dave Trafford for Story Studio Network. Enjoy your long holiday weekend.